Across the UK, on DAB digital radio, online and on your smart speaker. This is Times Radio, the voice of the Times.
It's 6 o'clock. I'm John Pienaar. Welcome to Pienaar and Friends. Tonight, that is Rachel Sylvester from The Times and the political strategist Joe Tanner. And you, very happy to have you here with us as ever. Share your thoughts and we can talk after the news with Martin Williams.
Thank you, John. Good afternoon. The US president says tariffs are going to work out very well. Wall Street is down almost 4% after a sharp bounce back yesterday following President Trump's 90-day pause on reciprocal tariffs to most countries. It's despite markets across Europe and Asia rallying. Import taxes on Chinese goods remain in place. Donald Trump's been speaking at a cabinet meeting at the White House in the last few moments.
It's been amazing. We had a big day yesterday. There'll always be transition difficulty, but we had in history, it was the biggest day in history, the markets. So we're very, very happy with the way the country's running. We're trying to get the world to treat us fairly.
The head of Britain's armed forces has visited China. It's the first trip by a chief of defence staff to the country in a decade. Beijing says Admiral Sir Tony Radakin discussed strengthening military cooperation between the two countries and gave a speech to new commanders. The Prime Minister says he doesn't think further inquiries, when we haven't even acted on the ones we've had, are necessarily the best way forward in tackling grooming gangs. Local investigations in 5 towns will go ahead after Labour blamed political misinformation for why some thought the plans had been watered down. Angela Rayner has been asked for some clarity.
We are having those 5 local inquiries. We've put £5 million into that, but we've also expanded that because other areas have said we want to do inquiries, we want to support that action.
Reform and the Conservatives want a full public inquiry which can compel witnesses. More than 2,000 government jobs are going. The Cabinet Office workforce is to be reduced by a third under government plans to slim down the civil service. A Romanian man's been arrested by counter-terrorism police investigating a fire at a DHL depot near Birmingham last July. Officers say the 38-year-old was detained on suspicion of assisting a foreign intelligence service. Investigations were reportedly looking at whether Russian spies planted a bomb in a parcel that caught alight. The man's been released on bail until July. Sir Keir Starmer's promising 3,000 new police officers on the streets by next year. It's part of his manifesto pledge to roll out the neighbourhood policing guarantee, employing 13,000 more officers by 2029, an increase of 50%. He announced the plans in Cambridgeshire with local officers.
These major reforms will help us prevent crime in the first place, because that's the way that you do your work, to tackle it when it happens and to stop it from spiralling. A transformation in neighbourhood policing.
And energy companies will soon be required to offer 24/7 support to customers who are cut off due to faulty meters. While some suppliers already do that, many people are currently unable to report issues or get advice outside of normal working hours. Regulator Ofgem says a day and night helpline must be available from August. Remember, our news podcasts are on the Times Radio app. Look for the Times News Briefing and the World in 10.
Across the UK, on DAB digital radio, on the free Times Radio app, and via your smart speaker.
John Pienaar on Times Radio Drive with NatWest Cushion.
It's really good to have you with us here on Pienaar and Friends, an hour of good conversation in very good company. Tonight, that is Rachel Sylvester from The Times and political strategist Joe Tanner. Good to see you, Joe. Good to see you, Rachel.
Hi, John. Hello.
Rachel, can I start with you? What's your thought for the day?
So my thought for the day is it's 100 years to the day that The Great Gatsby was published. And somehow that seems so appropriate now, that amazing line in it about the careless people who smash things up and then retreat into their wealth and privilege. And there's something that seems so appropriate about that with Donald Trump and his allies smashing everything up for the world, you know, and this sense also of the sort of fragility actually of the American dream. Trump thinks, you know, America's bigger and better than everyone else and that he could get away with this kind of bullying tactic of the tariffs. And actually he's found that that's not true. The sort of the giant has clay feet, if you like. So it just reminded me, and I thought actually at the end, I'm imagining Donald Trump staring out, looking at the green light at the end of the dock, like in The Great Gatsby, that sense of, I wonder how mournful or worried he is, or whether actually he will still be feeling like The Great Gatsby, the sort of slightly swaggering, wealthy, but actually built on sand, house built on sand.
I'm guessing President Trump would be quite flattered by the comparison in a strange
exactly.
way.
It's interesting, isn't it? I think he probably would. He actually almost seems to model himself on that sort of Gatsby-esque figure, larger than life. It's all kind of swagger and wealth and gold taps.
Yeah. In the movie, who played Gatsby? It was Robert Redford.
Oh, yeah, later on. It was
Leonardo DiCaprio
as well.
Earlier version. So to be played by Leonardo DiCaprio, and before that, Robert Redford, I don't think Trump would mind that a bit, would he?
No, exactly.
He'd love that.
Yeah, probably think these guys, they probably think they were as good looking as me, he's thinking. What's your thought for the day, Jay?
Well, so mine is slightly different, actually, and it's on the subject of close to my heart of good communication, John. And I don't know if you saw, but it got some attention after the event. I actually saw it live. Prince William was at the Aston Villa and PSG game last night, and took time to be interviewed by Ali McCoist and Rio Ferdinand, and became a fully fledged football pundit last night. It was actually really impressive, and it struck me that we often sort of focused on King Charles and how when he was Prince of Wales, he would often talk about his pet subjects, the environment, and, these comments that were made about how he talked to his plants and all sorts of stuff. And William's always had this interest in football. I run the Parliamentary Women's Football team. We had a match once in part of London, and we played on a pitch next to William, who actually plays football quite regularly with a group of people, and it's never reported. It's not something that's talked about formally. But he does have this huge passion around football, and it sort of struck me that particularly Aston Villa, when you will remember a former Prime Minister being asked who his favourite team was, and David Cameron couldn't remember that it was Villa when he was asked in the interview. But William was incredible. The sort of the knowledge about the players, the team, the tactics. He even spoke a bit about PSG. It was fascinating, and I just thought, do you know what? You can't make that stuff up. You can't brief it. That's somebody who really is passionate, and he showed it. And I thought it was really good.
For those who might not have seen that, Prince William doing the sort of football pundit thing. This is a clip of Prince William on TNT Sports last night.
We all saw the Liverpool game and PSG's intensity. I mean, in the first leg, they were unbelievable. They gave a lot of pressure. They pressed very high. And so I think for Unai tonight and the team, it's about managing that press. Unai likes it when their teams come onto them, play quite high press. But obviously there's a limit, and that, can we get round the press? Can we beat it? So I'm thinking long ball a bit. I'm thinking also how they're going to get round the high press. So it's going to be a challenging night, and I'm looking forward to the tactics that Unai is going to have to employ.
Can I just say something? Do not go for a punditry job, please, because I could be out of the game. The way you just dissected that there, I'm going to nick that for later on.
That's Rio Ferdinand there, just doing his bit for a knighthood a little bit further down the line. I heard that. I saw this. I watched the game last night. There was Prince William. I've got to say, I warmed to him. I mean, I am actually a royalist. I don't get massively engaged in the sort of ins and outs of royal family comings and goings especially, but I liked that, and I saw the cutaway shot when the Aston Villa goal went in.
And did you see him hugging the players as they went out onto the pitch, as they went through the tunnel? He was shaking everyone's hand, arms around them. He clearly really cared.
He was clearly out of his mind with joy. And as a football fan, I thought, that guy's a football fan. He's a proper football fan.
It came across as totally authentic, didn't it? And quite knowledgeable.
I mean, I still don't quite know what the press is. He talked about the press a lot. And I was like, press?
No, I mean, he knows what
in
that
his brother's context, it's normally the press is a very different conversation. Yes. But I was like, the press, he knows what he meant. But I was like, what is the press exactly?
Well, good luck to him. I heard it suggest his analysis there suggested it wasn't especially original. But, I mean, how many of us who like football are experts? I'm not an expert in football. I've been watching football my entire life. I know that I'm desperate for my team to win on Saturday.
You'd be desperate to manage Palace for a game or two, wouldn't you? You could definitely do something.
For their sake, I hope that never happens. I know what I'm looking at. I know what I like. But when it comes to profound analysis, I couldn't sit there with Rio Ferdinand and trade line for line.
I mean, it's pretty ballsy stuff to do it, to be willing to stand there. And where he was as well, it wasn't like a studio. It was actually like the tunnel.
Yes.
So it was where there was lots of comings and goings and stuff, and they just stood there. And he had his hand in his pocket, and he was just very, he looked very relaxed. He looked very comfortable, actually, which I thought made it even more enjoyable to watch.
Yeah, well, I had a little laugh about the idea of Rio Ferdinand going for a gong with his praise of the totally unfair. But speaking of gongs, we've got Rishi Sunak, the former Prime Minister's honours list coming out tomorrow, obviously under heavy embargo. It's all very hush-hush, but some of it has come out and some of it's been reported. Joe, you were saying a moment ago. Tell us what you do know.
So Lucy Fisher at the FT has exclusively revealed that Michael Gove is set to receive a peerage, which is a rumour that Kate Ferguson from The Sun on Sunday has said has been doing the rounds for some time. And there's also a suggestion that fellow ex-cabinet ministers Simon Hart and Alistair Jack. Simon Hart, you'll remember, had recently written a rather colourful book that he'd released about his time as Chief Whip. And that also the ex-Tory CEO Stephen Massey are apparently on a 7-person strong list. So we'll find out very soon. But these lists, you remember, sort of previous Prime Ministers, they always have a list that comes out and they can get delayed. There's all sorts of sort of questions that are asked and hoops people have to jump through. But yeah, Gove is topping it as the sort of the one that perhaps maybe expected, maybe not.
That's an interesting line. And when we sort of get these, it's the resignation honours this we're talking about here. It's always watched very closely, and it's usually picked apart, and quite often for very good reasons. Now, this one may be quite unexceptional, which would be an exception to the rule because they always are.
What's interesting about Gove is he's left politics in theory to go and be editor of The Spectator, but he will now
call that leaving politics.
If you leave that, yes, but he'll now have a platform in the House of Lords, and he is one of the most interesting politicians of his generation, don't you think? In terms of public service reform, every department he was at, he really set about radical change, for better or for worse, but his legacy from education is still there. At Justice, he tried to reform the prisons. Even at agriculture, he really did quite a lot. He was a sort of really interesting cabinet minister wherever he went.
And very controversial.
Controversial, but I always found him interesting because he had this theory of the lost boys. So, like in Peter Pan, the boys who fell out of the back of the pram and got rescued by Peter Pan, I think it was. Anyway, but he, I think, saw himself as a little bit of a lost boy himself, that he'd been adopted and he could have fallen off the back of the pram and he didn't. And he wanted to help other children who were being failed by education, who were then ending up in young offenders institutions. And he had this sort of sense of mission in his politics, which I think he'll take through with him to the Lords.
And he's also used to having a platform to speak. And so the challenge will be, as a Conservative peer, but then the editor of The Spectator, well, if you've got the Tory whip, but then actually the magazine starts taking a pretty contrary view of something that's going on from the Tory side, could actually be quite interesting as to how he's... I don't think
they enforce the Tory whip in the Lords with the same kind of steel that they do in the Commons.
Boris Johnson did it, didn't he? He had the double job at one point.
And that is the thing. Like there is still a degree of... There's no way that Kemi Badenoch's going to put up with somebody in the Lords with the Tory whip who then really does cause her problems. I think it's going to be an interesting balance, and people often forget when they take these roles in the Lords, but then they have something else that they do outside. It can sometimes cause serious conflict.
Yeah, true. It'd be quite a brave move for Kemi Badenoch to fall out very publicly with the editor of The Spectator. However, maybe that's a story we can look forward to sometime in the future.
We'll sit tight, it'll happen.
Well, you're probably right about that. I mean,
we'll wait until if he backs reform. Do you remember we were talking about that a few weeks ago?
Yeah.
Could The Spectator switch?
So many stories to come. And you obviously you appreciate, and you're not the only one, Rachel, Michael Gove's capacity for making a difference in the jobs that he's held in government, which brings me neatly to the difference you make to the public agenda, as you have and as you do. And let's just let you have the floor here and give your own Crime and Justice Commission a bit of a plug. We can't, I've got a copy of it in front of me. I'm not allowed to tell people what's in it.
You've heard, your listeners and our listeners have heard over the year, really, clips from all the evidence sessions, and we've just this afternoon got the hard copies of the report in, which we'll be sending out to all MPs, relevant peers, all ministers. We've biked one to Keir Starmer at number 10. So anyone who's interested can ask to see one, and it'll be available digitally as well. And we've got a 10-point plan for reform of the courts, of the prisons, of the police, of the whole different aspects of the crime and justice, violence against women, victims, all kinds of things. And I think if the government did go ahead and implement this blueprint for reform, it would make a real difference.
Yeah, we can't break the embargo, but your previous reports have broken some ground and been taken up and caused a good deal of public debate. And I'm not just saying that because we've discussed all of those reports in some detail. It is a fact they've made really significant contributions. Do you anticipate that this one will? Well, from what you know, what's in it, we can't talk about it. But is it going to do the same?
I hope so, because I think we've followed the evidence. That's the trick of all these commissions. So it's not coming at it with any ideological hobby horse. It's just trying to follow what works around the world and look at what's sensible and what's going to make a difference and what's practical and pragmatic.
Just a teaser then for the Crime and Justice Commission, chaired by Rachel Sylvester, which is published now and is going to be available, Rachel, where?
So it'll be available from Monday. It'll be in the paper in a supplement on Monday, with a couple of bits coming out over the next few days in the meantime.
Next peerage, John.
Yeah, quite.
We have to say,
Rachel,
incredible passion. Like, how many times you've devoted your thought of the day to something that you've done on this. Like, it shines through in the way you talk, like how much you care about this stuff. And I really hope what you recommend is taken up.
Yeah, echo that. Here. Now, more to talk about on Pienaar and Friends with Joe Tanner and Rachel Sylvester, and me, I'm John Pienaar. And you too, tell me what you're thinking, what's on your mind on another busy day, a busy week, a busy month, and many more of those, I think, stretching in front of us. Share your thoughts. Send me a text, 87222. Start with the word Times and just make your thoughts plain to us. Give us your contribution. A tweet to @Times Radio or a voice note. I am oddly pleased to get those things. A voice note in your own voice, your own message in your own way on WhatsApp to 0333 003 2353. You're listening to Pienaar and Friends on Times Radio in association with NatWest Cushion, making workplace pensions and savings easy. Search NatWest Cushion to find out more.
Kate Borsay, tonight from 7 on Times Radio.
John Pienaar on Times Radio Drive with NatWest Cushion, putting your employees in control of their financial future. Search NatWest Cushion to find out more.
And here with me on Pienaar and Friends, Rachel Sylvester, Times columnist, and also Joe Tanner, political strategist and advisor. So, well, at the moment, Donald Trump is still chairing that cabinet meeting of his. He's going around the table. I think every member of the cabinet is getting a chance to have their say. And I think Elon Musk is making a contribution now. We're going to be watching that. I mean, you never know with Elon Musk. If there's anything you need to hear, we're going to share that with you. I absolutely promise. And today, what's been happening today? Well, the markets. We started off the day, didn't we, Joe and Rachel, with the markets were just rallying significantly. The move was much more optimistic, maybe an enormous collective sigh of relief across the markets in Asia than in Europe. what happened yesterday when Donald Trump pulled back from the cliff edge of a slide into global tariff war, maybe even a global recession, even a global depression. Just relief about that. And then later on in the day, much more recently, in the American markets, it's been much more even. It even sank rather than went up just a little bit. The worries about the situation we're still in, including the continuing trade war with China, those worries are reasserting themselves on the mind of traders, and maybe that's natural that they should, because those problems haven't gone away and they're still pretty worrying.
I think what's fascinating is the markets, in a way, don't lie. They don't suck up. They can't be summoned to the Oval Office for humiliation. It's the wisdom of crowds, if you like, and Donald Trump can't bully them into submission, as he's found out to his, he's had to U-turn because of that. So that's what, for me, is really interesting, that he has tried to act as this sort of strong man, but actually the markets have shown that even somebody like that has to... It's exactly the same with Liz Truss. There is a sort of... there's an underlying truth there. They speak truth to power in the way that often another individual can't, or politician can't, because they've got to try and keep in with Trump. Yeah,
there's still so much uncertainty there. This is, if the problem is uncertainty, it's still thick in the air.
Yeah, and I think even watching some of the footage from this cabinet meeting, it's lots of members around the table sort of telling Donald Trump what a great job he's done, what terrible state America was left in, and lots of this narrative of trying to justify every step that they're taking. But it is interesting, the sort of the fallout, the footage, for example. Trump yesterday kind of talking in the Oval Office about how much money individuals had made that day, and how the stock market had recovered. It was the greatest rise ever, and sort of almost revelling in the chaos. But clearly there are people around him that are uncomfortable about this, and I think the interesting thing is, we talk a lot about when will the Republican Party sort of take a stand? When will they actually be more concerned than they appear to be showing about some of this chaos that seems to be almost personally driven? Way the reaction to stuff feels very personal from Trump. So I don't know where it ends. It just feels like a hell of a roller coaster to be stuck on right now. Yeah, and we can catch up with the mood on the other side of the Atlantic after the news. Molly Ball from the Wall Street Journal is going to be joining us. I think Harriet Alexander, I've been corrected on the Harriet Alexander, familiar to this programme, the US correspondent, with her take from the other side of the pond. So just focusing on the view of us in this country, we were talking to Luke Trell just a short while ago from More in Common. The British public, when you look at the latest polling, guys, it's pretty bullish out there. There is an appetite for Britain to respond pretty robustly to what's been going on. Britons, according to the latest numbers, are nearly twice as likely to support than to oppose retaliating to the US tariffs. 51% think that the UK should retaliate with tariffs on the USA. Only 27% disagree with that. Labour voters apparently most firm in their support for retaliation. That's 61% of Labour people in favour, only 25 against. But it crosses all sorts of party lines. Although Reform voters who are split down the middle, even Reform voters are split down the middle. And there's very little appetite in these latest opinion polls for concessions on the British side to reach a trade deal with the United States. So again, pressures on the government from all sorts of different directions.
And there's such hostility to Donald Trump in this country, isn't there? I think people just don't trust him. People don't like him. They feel he's taken advantage. People really dislike the way he treated Zelensky. So it's a difficult line for Keir Starmer to tread, but he's got to, in the end, do what he thinks is right for the country. And if he escalates a trade war and retaliates and, the whole thing builds up, that ultimately isn't going to be good for British jobs, British consumers and the economy in this country. So he's got to play a long game. But I also think it's interesting the way in which he's sort of siding with other European leaders. So he's definitely, he talks about himself as the bridge between Europe and America, but you've seen him much more standing alongside Emmanuel Macron. So even though Britain's no longer in the EU, Starmer's somehow managed to pitch himself as part of the sort of European leadership. even after Brexit. So I think he's, in a way, people are going to judge him on that wider picture rather than just how he responds specifically to Donald Trump.
And we know the public respond to how it feels in their pocket. We know that was a really big problem in America for the Democrats, and we know that polling's been done extensively here about how people feel. The Good Growth Foundation did their report about the growth gap and talked about what do people feel in terms of what's their perception of growth. And actually, it's all about what makes a difference to their lives. So the problem is, at the moment, it's theoretical. All of this stuff is theoretical. So we may poll people who say they don't really think that we should expand airports. But in reality, Luton Airport got the go-ahead. What happened 2 days later? We find out there's 28,000 jobs and a big theme park going to be opening down the road. That is the trade-offs that have to happen to make things happen are not always things that we feel comfortable with, but inevitably have to happen. And quite frankly, I don't like it, but if our Prime Minister has to do something that's a bit uncomfortable, but means that we don't lose, hundreds of thousands of jobs in this country because different industries go under, then I'll actually take it if I have to. I won't like it, but I understand that goes with the job. And that is part of the challenge that we're facing now.
Yeah. I mean, look, so not among everyone, there's obviously divisions of opinion, but a lot of people out there would like to see Britain take on Donald Trump, Keir Starmer eyeball Donald Trump and tell him where to get off and take action against him. But you're right. If that led to material consequences for the country, and we are talking about material consequences, you never know with Donald Trump. If the retaliation came in thick and fast, we are talking about British economic growth being affected, jobs in this country being affected, prices being affected. You might think that sort of warlike attitude might just waver just a little bit. But look at what people are saying in these polls. We're seeing that Britons no longer see America as an ally. 30% of people say they see America as an enemy. And just think about that. This is America, our strongest, most powerful, firmest friend in this country since the war, now seen by a third of people as an actual enemy. It's mind-boggling.
Well, it hasn't been an ally, has it? Donald Trump has not been a reliable ally.
For sure.
He's been a deeply unreliable one, deeply unpredictable, siding with Putin over Zelensky at times, describing Zelensky as a dictator. This is not the behaviour of an ally. And the disruption of tariffs, even, we're all relieved that he's backed away from some of the higher tariffs, but there's still the 10% across the board, still 25% on cars and some of the other industries. So it's not that he's kind of completely abandoned the whole project. He's still being a really disruptive, unhelpful character for Britain.
And we're stuck with him for a while. The reality is, the reality is the reality. We've seen what's happened with China, and do we need to pick a fight by then doing something in terms of standing up, or do we just see what the decision is? Do we see what the move is? There'll be lots of conversations going on behind the scenes, but we also know in reality that the Prime Minister and his team have been working far closer with Europe. We know that there are going to have to be concessions given on that side as well. There was talk about when there was talk about the European defence contracts, there was talk about fishing rights coming into the mix.
Yes.
So, we're going to get the Brexiteers all upset anyway about that, because we're going to have to do things we don't like. We are stuck in a really, it's a really unpleasant sandwich that we're currently in, because there are going to be trade-offs on both sides that are not going to be popular, and there's going to be a lot of holding of noses of things that are going to have to happen. But we are where we are. I don't think there is I don't think it's our path to choose necessarily. I think there are lots and lots of, huge potholes and elephant traps and goodness knows what on those paths that I don't know if there is a right or wrong right now. I also think, and I do feel incredibly sorry for a government that is still relatively new. There are lots of inexperienced people. Post-Brexit, we lost a lot of good trade people because a lot of people left the civil service. So we're not in our best shape to even be doing any of this, which, doesn't make this an easier choice either way.
Yeah, mind you, it's not as if people out there are completely, completely deluding themselves about the amount of clout and the firepower that we've got when it comes to changing the president's mind or influencing events. I mean, here's some more interesting numbers. 8% of people think the Prime Minister, only 8, will get the best deal for Britain by going along with what Trump wants. 14% think he'll get the best deal by standing up to Trump. These are low numbers. Meanwhile, 61% tell the pollsters that Starmer, the Prime Minister's actions, won't make a difference because the US President will do whatever he wants regardless. And that is probably the most realistic appraisal you're going to get all day.
One thing I think that's interesting, though, is if you compare now Britain and America, Britain looks like a sort of beacon of stability in contrast. And in fact, around Europe as well, there's been sort of much more frenetic times. I think Rachel Reeves is now, I heard today, the second longest finance minister in the G7.
Yes.
So there's been this kind of churn across the world. And Britain's now starting to look quite stable with this government with a big majority, moderate government. That could be to Starmer's advantage.
Yeah.
And, you know, businesses look to that kind of thing. They like consistency. They like solidness. So I guess that's if there is a chink of light in the situation, that would be it.
And let's be realistic. If something bad happens, it's almost better that it happens because you haven't done something rather than if you have. Because if you're the PM and you're thinking about your own numbers, if you do something and you really do poke the bear and it doesn't go very well, that's really going to be held on you.
Yeah.
So there is a decision at that point about how you play the game.
Right. Well, if it's a chink of light, let's strain towards it. If it's a straw, let's grasp it. It's that kind of time. In a moment, after the news, we can hear from Kate Borsay, who takes over at 7 o'clock. And we will have on the programme our colleague stateside to get us right up to date with what's going on there. That cabinet meeting still going on. They spend more time talking to the media at these cabinet meetings than they do to each other. I think, actually, literally, that's the case. However, now it is 6:31 on Pienaar Friends. Let's get the news with Martin Williams.
Across the UK, on DAB, online and on your smart speaker. This is Times Radio.
John, thank you very much. Good evening to you. Donald Trump says his plan of taxing imports of goods from countries around the world is going to work out very well. Markets in the US are down despite the US president announcing a 90-day pause in his tariffs for most countries except China. Downing Street says the UK will coolly and calmly continue its negotiations with the US president and have insisted they'd remain cautious in the face of instability. Raoul Ruparel is director for Boston Consulting Group's Centre for Growth.
Clearly, there were concerns about the functioning of the market in US Treasuries, which, given it is one of the largest markets globally, was quite serious. So clearly that did have a factor in the decision. I do think the fact that there were lots of countries willing to negotiate probably helps and allows them to frame it as such and put that pause and try to secure a deal.
The Home Secretary's denied suggestions inquiries into grooming gangs have been watered down, confirming they'll go ahead in 5 towns. The Prime Minister's argued, though, a full public national investigation wouldn't be the best way forward when there are still outstanding recommendations to make from previous ones. A former school dinner lady's been jailed for at least 17 years for terror offences, having planned to join Islamic State in Afghanistan. A judge described 36-year-old Farishta Jami as having an entrenched extremist mindset. And Deputy Prime Minister Angela Rayner's told bin workers on strike in Birmingham to accept a new pay offer she's called significantly improved. Rubbish has been piling up on the city's streets for more than a month. Remember, you can hear the Times' renowned foreign correspondents analyse the biggest global security stories every day on our World in 10 podcast.
This is Times Radio.
Strategist and Rachel Sylvester, Times columnist, and Kate Borsay, who takes over at 7 o'clock. Hi, Kate.
Hiya, John. We'll, of course, continue the discussion about tariffs. I mean, it's interesting because Keir Starmer's pretty much said this afternoon that he accepts that 10% baseline tariff is not going anywhere. He said it's not temporary. The White House have repeated that as well. But it seems that the Prime Minister has all but conceded defeat, certainly for the short to middle distance of this, I think, on tariffs. He knows that trade deal is not going to get signed off anytime soon. It would take something extraordinary, we've heard today from Donald Trump's economic advisor, in order to get a trade deal over the line. They are up for negotiating, though, but I think with the UK at 10%, perhaps there's some hope for autos, steel at 25%. Perhaps there's some hope there. But I think that is a pretty strong concession from Keir Starmer today, that trade deal is not going to get signed anytime soon. And we've already heard from the Bank of England today that even at 10%, it's going to affect the UK's growth, those tariffs. We've been speaking to Elżbieta Biankowska, the former Deputy PM of Poland. The EU, of course, clawed back their retaliatory tariffs today that they'd announced yesterday. She has actually told me that she didn't think that the EU doing counter tariffs on the US was actually the best approach anyway. She doesn't think that the EU perhaps acted as they should have done on that. So that was an interesting take from her. She also, because she works for a think tank now, she's not in politics, called Donald Trump narcissistic and unpredictable to me. I wanted to get her tuppence in there. Also on the show tonight, we're speaking to Christo Grozev, who's an investigative journalist. He was one of the Bellingcat journalists that revealed that there were 2 FSB agents who were sent to Salisbury for that Novichok poisoning of Sergei Skripal and his daughter Yulia. And he's uncovered loads of big Russian stories as well. During the making of a documentary that he took part in, they basically were able to were kind of happened upon a plot to kill him happening whilst the documentary was taking place. It was the Bulgarian spies who were ensconced in the UK, rather bizarrely, having stayed in Holiday Inn after Holiday Inn, and there was a big plot to kill Christo Grozev, who'll be speaking to us this evening. We'll find out what it's like to be on Russia's hit list. And Harry Wallop's been writing in the Times, this will appear in the paper tomorrow, about how we should bring the communal tea break back. John, there was that sort of gag, wasn't there, flying around the internet about a month ago about how here in the UK we ring the bell for tea and all of us have this tea break at the same time. Completely fictional. But Harry Wallop's run with this because there's been some new data released for a book that says that although the good news is that many of us find our work satisfying, we're very satisfied with our work, we don't necessarily find it meaningful, we don't think we make a difference. And some of the data points to the fact that actually if we want to find our job more meaningful, Harry Wallop argues, we should take a communal tea break. It's found to increase productivity afterwards, to get the workplace culture going and to invest in each other.
It's the biscuits that normally appear at the tea break, I reckon, give you a boost.
But there
in
is
the
something
afternoon.
about being with your colleagues. I mean, I used to work in a restaurant as a waitress, and before we opened at 5 o'clock every day, we would have a communal dinner together. Not something from the restaurant's menu, but something the chef had made us, and it was just a really nice time of day because we could talk about how many bookings we had, what was coming up, but also get to know our colleagues in that kind of high-pressure situation.
Dinner, in restaurants.
Yeah, we used to talk about the water cooler moments and how they were important for, you know, getting staff and understand. And actually, the equivalent for the UK is probably a tea break. It's probably making... I think, actually, it's the hot water taps have caused the problem. Because you used to put the kettle on and all sort of stand around waiting for the kettle, but now you can do it so quickly.
Instant hot water.
You just sort of queue up, get your water, and off you go again. I think the taps are killing that moment. Yeah. That's my theory.
That's a beautifully British sentiment. The unifying power of the British kettle. I love
Ban
it.
the hot water taps. I love it. But yeah, we'll be talking about that in the show. Should we bring back a communal tea break? I mean, it feels like something we could never do here, John, but back in the day, you can probably tell us that there would have been moments where newsrooms as a community got together.
Usually in the pub. I mean,
well,
this was lunchtime.
However it happened,
John. There,
so what are you drinking?
The long lunch went ages ago, even at Westminster, didn't it, Joe?
That was the expense.
Yeah,
expense
I remember them fondly. There's long journalistic lunches that sort of carried on bleeding into dinner time and way beyond that.
Then suddenly the news at 10 calls and asked you to do a hit.
No, not since I was being a broadcaster. That was more as a writing hack. But that was another world, another time. He said wistfully, with his eyes misting over.
It is Thursday though, John. So you know, not long until you can indulge for the weekend.
All right, looking forward to your show at 7 o'clock right after this. Kate Borsey. Now let's welcome to the group Harriet Alexander. Welcome back to the group, Harriet Alexander, freelance journalist based in New York City, now live on the line. Hi to you, Harriet.
Hello, John.
It's great to have you back, Harriet. I'll just ask you first, just talking on there, the Times is picking up on the words of Keir Starmer, as Kate was telling us, who seems to be pretty much giving up on hopes of any kind of really big win when it comes to the British search, what seems like an eternal search, Harriet, for a trade deal with Donald Trump. He's saying, and here's the quote from Keir Starmer speaking in Cambridgeshire here, "I'm clear this is a change which isn't, in my view, temporary, and therefore we've got to do the margins of making sure we turbocharge our own economy." A few words, Harriet, but they say a great deal. I mean, getting the president, certainly where Keir Starmer's concerned, to roll back on what is now the new baseline is going to be quite hard work.
Yes, I think so. I think that's, it might be a bitter pill to swallow, but I think it's quite a realistic one. Given the turmoil, given the chaos, trying to get any sort of certainty right now is incredibly hard. Trump is having his cabinet meeting as we speak. You referenced it a minute ago. He's lining up his cabinet members to praise him and talk about what a great moment this was. He said himself, "What a day, but more great days coming." That was his message to the nation last night on social media. So, I mean, he and his advisors are pinning this as a masterstroke. It seems more and more likely that it was kind of a panic move because the way that the bond market in particular was moving. Interestingly, he had lunch on Wednesday with the legendary investor Charles Schwab, which may have seemed to have had something to do with it. But also, John, I was remembering how you and I last week, all those days ago, we were talking about how Peter Doocy, the Fox News reporter, asked the White House whether they were shorting the Dow. Well, actually, there are now investigations into that happening. Elizabeth Warren and others are looking into that because Trump tweeted yesterday morning, "This is a great time to buy." That was at 9:37 a.m. And by 1:18 p.m., he was calling off these tariffs. So wild times around here.
I mean, the mere suggestion you might remember back in general election time in this country, it seems like sort of League Division 27 compared to what we're talking about here, if not 227. But we had people inside Number 10 Downing Street who it turned out were putting bets on the dates of the general election using inside knowledge, and that caused a scandal at the time. Now, the idea of anyone in the White House using foreknowledge of the lifting of or the easing of tariffs to make a killing, and it could be a massive killing on the stock exchange using that knowledge, that would be an extraordinary scandal. And we can't say that happened. Now there's an investigation, fascinatingly, you tell us, Harriet, going on. Look, these things are chucked around like bricks on Capitol Hill, aren't they? But the mere fact, Rachel and Joe, that should be discussed. The idea of the White House, anyone in the White House, making a lot of money by just going quietly and going to the markets and putting their money on shares that are about to go soaring, and only they know that. Insider trading in its purest form. The fact those words should be said out loud, my goodness.
Well, also the fact is that actually Trump did tweet that in the morning, this is a good time to buy. That in itself is pretty extraordinary, presumably knowing what he was going to be doing later that day. Or maybe he didn't know, but I assume he did.
I think he claims that he hadn't made his mind up when he put that out there.
It's just part of that sense that the normal rules don't apply, or he thinks the normal rules don't apply, isn't it? But on a massive, massive scale.
And that's the point. I think the interesting bit is Trump's line on all of this has been that it's going to benefit those Americans that voted for him. But there is going to be a sort of tipping point because, the sort of focus that Americans have on their pension funds, their concern about their pensions, it's a big deal for Americans. So when those things are affected and when the news will inevitably come out, you won't be able to hide the fact that people have made money. And if they have, it just will become evident. And there was sort of almost jubilation from Trump about what had happened to the stock market. There was talk in the Oval Office when people came in. He said, "Oh, look how much money they made today." And it was sort of this partly sort of detachment from those very people he was saying he was doing this all for. Yeah. It actually looked like he was surrounded by some of the actual people he was doing this for. And so I think there will be a sort of truth will eventually out, and it's how long that takes. But I think the American public will be very upset.
Oh, you could put it mildly. We don't know that that's the case. Let's be clear.
But if it is, and there is definitely concern that is the way that things may have unfolded. But either way, I think that's the very point. It's a suggestion, but people will be looking for the evidence. And if the evidence does exist, it will be found.
Well,
and Harriet, I'm really interested what the business reaction has been to all this, because actually the one thing business hates more than anything is uncertainty. And Trump wants to sort of bring manufacturing back into America to help those workers that we're talking about. Has there been a backlash from business? Are people talking about shutting factories, moving? There's presumably no plans for people to bring production back to the US.
Yes, no, you're right that business has not reacted favourably to Trump even rescinding the tariffs, because I think to a large extent the damage has been done. Trump was arguing on the one hand that the tariffs were there because they wanted to bring back American manufacturing, but on the other hand he was saying it's a negotiating tactic. Well, you can't have it both ways. It can't be both things, because as you say, the businesses want stability, and they don't have that. They don't have that today. They didn't have it yesterday. I think it's really interesting what is coming out of Wall Street at the moment. Divisions. Goldman Sachs this morning put out a note saying that they thought that the recession was no longer a base case scenario, but JP Morgan's lead US economist was actually saying that he still thinks a recession is more likely than not.
Yes.
So the markets aren't reassured by this.
No, and just going back to that pretty revealing comment of Starmer's thinking, when he thinks that this is not a temporary situation, we're going to be stuck with the 10% tariff, which he announced at the time of those so-called reciprocal tariffs. The president, they're nothing of the kind. They're certainly not reciprocal tariffs. They're worked out on the back of a cigarette packet, but we're stuck with them at 10%, and the object now must be to try and do something about the 25% tariff on cars, steel, aluminium. 10%, though, is a big hit. That's the kind of number that Rachel Reeves, maybe relief at the time it was announced that it wasn't as bad as some of those in East Asia, but still a 10% hit. That is going to knock those numbers that we heard about just a couple of weeks ago, and it feels like centuries, in the Chancellor's spring statement. 10% hit like that is going to really hit public finances. It's really going to drive us further towards the risk of recession. And the spending plans we're going to hear about in June, later on in the budget, they're going to be affected. We'll talk about that in just a minute with Joe Tanner, with Rachel Sylvester, and Harriet Alexander there with us from New York City. This is Pienaar and Friends on Times Radio. So President Trump is still at it. He's still in that cabinet meeting, which is much more like a news conference. He's probably happier in news conferences than cabinet meetings, but it's still going on. I'm just going to take us back a moment to the beginning of that, when we heard the president talking about the market turmoil over the last few days.
We had a big day yesterday. There'll always be transition difficulty, but we had in history, it was the biggest day in history, the markets. So we're very, very happy with the way the country's running. We're trying to get the world to treat us fairly. And this is something that should have been done 25 years ago, and it wasn't. Should have been done 40 years ago, and it wasn't. But no president was willing to take it on, but you had to. It's not sustainable. It wasn't sustainable.
And President Trump said he believed everything would work out well.
The biggest problem they have is they don't have enough time in the day. Everybody wants to come and make a deal. And we're working with a lot of different countries, and it's all going to work out very well. I think it's going to work out really very well. But we're in good shape. There's no inflation. There's very little inflation. And I went 4 years without inflation, and I took in hundreds of billions of dollars from China and others, taxes in China. But we took in hundreds of billions of dollars a year from China, and we had no inflation, essentially.
So President Trump seemingly happy with the way things are going. But here's the thing, Joe, Rachel and Harriet in New York. The public on both sides of the Atlantic don't seem to quite agree with that. I'm looking now at a poll from Ipsos, which tells us that Harriet, 74% of Britons, but 70% of Americans think that increasing tariffs makes everyday goods more expensive. That's not a message, Harriet, the president's been keen to get across.
Right, and that polling is actually up from when they were last asking the question, probably 10 days ago. And that's because there's been an awful lot of coverage here about what tariffs actually mean. So, people voted for Trump back in November thinking, yes, make America great again and bring back the economy, bring back manufacturing. But they perhaps didn't realize what that was going to mean. Whereas now it's wall-to-wall coverage on the fact that your Nike trainers are going to get a lot more expensive. There's been panic buying of iPhones because that's something that it's impossible to make in the United States. There's been some quite fun detailing of the fact that there's 40 different countries involved in the making of an iPhone. So that's something that simply can't be made here. Your coffee, your chocolate, that doesn't grow in the United States and the mainland US. So people are really waking up to what tariffs mean. So that's why you have the 70% now saying it's not a good idea.
Yeah, let's just go back a bit on what was it that drove Donald Trump to make that massive U-turn yesterday, which of course he and his White House team denied was any kind of U-turn. But what else do you call it? Well, the bond markets. The turmoil in the bond markets, the market in American debt, that was going the wrong way. That was an enormous amount of pressure. Days of problems when it came to the stock market too. All of that had its impact. They'd been lobbying from corporate bosses, from Republicans on Capitol Hill, from lobbyists in Washington, D.C. Goodness knows there's plenty of those. But also there's been a report that one of the pressures came from the president's own Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent. The idea that he might have threatened to resign. This is Anthony Scaramucci, the famous Anthony Scaramucci, speaking on the rest of his politics. Have a listen.
My MAGA sources are telling me that Secretary of Treasury Scott Bessent had a little bit of a face-off with the president, said that he was probably going to have to leave the administration if they didn't do something differently. And so now looks like he's got the ball on tariffs, and he is basically telling people we're going to suspend these now at least for 90 days.
Well, Harriet Alexander in New York, is that story running? I mean, Anthony Scaramucci's got a way of grabbing the headlines, but that idea that Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, was contemplating maybe resigning over this, that's been around for a few days. Is there anything like corroboration or confirmation from official or unofficial from anywhere on that so far, Harriet?
No, I mean, and I don't think we're likely to get official confirmation for some time, because it seems like Bessent is there for now. But it certainly rings true, actually, because some of the financiers, the business people who were appealing to Trump publicly to change course, they were saying, let Scott Bessent take control of this, because he's actually well respected. He's got a track record in this area. Of course, a lot of the people who have come into the Trump administration are friends of his. You've got, people like Steve Witkoff, who's off negotiating peace in Russia and Gaza and Ukraine, and he has no background in that. He's a real estate developer. But actually, Bessent is a sensible figure. He's trusted by the market. He's trusted by Wall Street. He's trusted by business people. So it's totally believable that he could say to Trump, I can't go through with this. This is not working for me. It's not working for the country. It's not working for you. So I think Scaramucci's line is very plausible.
Yeah, it would have been quite an event, wouldn't it? The loss of the Treasury Secretary at a time like this, a Treasury Secretary with an enormous amount of cred when it comes to corporate America and Wall Street, going out at this point. First term of Trump was all about resignations. They came along more regularly than number 12 buses. But to have lost Bessent now, obviously no confirmation of that, but as Harriet says, it's a plausible notion. That would have hurt.
Absolutely, and it would have been deeply damaging. Harriet, what about the role of Musk in all of this? Do you think he's been an influential character, or is he now much more sidelined in the White House?
It's really interesting you raise that, actually, because Musk, could be doing a victory loop, right? Because he was very publicly at war with Peter Navarro, Trump's top trade advisor, who's incredibly hawkish on tariffs. Navarro has literally written the book about trade tariffs and is very hard line on this. And Musk and him were sparring publicly earlier in this week. Musk said that he was a moron and dumber than bricks, and then apologized to bricks. So, Musk and Navarro have been at each other's throats, but Musk is not present today in the cabinet meeting. He was in the previous one. I mean, what to read into that, I don't know. But Musk will certainly be very relieved that these tariffs have been lifted because, they were affecting his business enormously.
Can I just ask, Harriet, one other thing that came to mind? John was talking earlier about polling in the UK and about the feeling that the UK Prime Minister should do something and that we should, there should be more action standing up to Trump. Is there any concern starting to feed through that actually the way that these tariffs have been set are all about the balance of trade as it's been decided by Trump? But what if there is a significant boycott globally of US goods? And so actually those numbers start to change for the worse. Is there a fear developing in sort of any sectors or any parts of the media reflecting anything that there is a worry that there could be a backlash against the US?
Yeah, I mean, I think on a wider scale, there is concern that America is not to be trusted anymore, not to be trusted diplomatically, that the old alliances that people believed in, sort of the post-war order, really, for the last 80 years, was being unraveled at a dizzying pace. So I think in general terms, yes, there is real concern that, America is turning its back on its allies. People have noted that Russia was not mentioned in those tariffs. And, people have been quite concerned about the rhetoric coming out of the White House about how Putin was someone that they could deal with, that they could make these agreements with. That certainly made people uneasy. As regards trade, you were asking, I mean, I think people are really concerned, firstly, with their day-to-day, with how it's going to impact their everyday purchases. They're realizing how much comes from abroad. Sort of the politics of global trade alliances, perhaps less so, but I think that would be coming. I think you're right.
I guess it's more consumer behaviour. I can remember when the Ukraine war started, people saying, I'll have vodka, but I won't have Russian vodka. And I heard that said in London bars. And I just wonder if the backlash could come that people will choose to buy the equivalent of what would have been produced in America previously.
Right. Oh, yeah. That's already happening in Canada incredibly strongly. The backlash in Canada is really, really being felt. And people are, there's huge sections of Canadian supermarkets now which are made in Canada. People are checking the labels. So that's definitely